Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Dr. Frederick Gooding Jr., aka Dr. G. But before we go any further, allow us to state that we respectfully acknowledge all Native American peoples who have lived on this land since time immemorial. TCU especially acknowledges and pays respect to the Wichita and affiliated tribes on whose historical homeland our university is located. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Dr. Frederick Gooding Jr., aka Dr. G, and I am chair of TCU's Race and Reconciliation Initiative. Thank you for joining us for our RRI Ramp Up Week, as we have events scheduled every day this week, leading up towards 4/21 or April 21st, where we plan to share the results of what we have found this first year on what we call Reconciliation Day. Please check with our website so you can check for more details, as we absolutely want everyone and all to know within our TC community that you are welcome. And returning back to RRI, I just want to acknowledge that we are simply designed to fulfill the goal of the Chancellor and Board of Trustees charge, which is to study TCU's relationship with slavery, racism, and the Confederacy. And so, by way of clarification, we are academically based, research-focused initiative. And so if we receive any questions outside of our scope, we will kindly redirect them to the appropriate parties. However, today's topic, you're in for a treat in terms of learning who is Charley Thorp. And if you do have questions, feel free to put them into the Q&A, and we will simply do our best to accommodate the questions that come in on the backside after the presentation. And ultimately, what we hope as a result of today's presentation is that we will provide critical perspective and deepen our understanding as we ultimately push forward and toward action and healing, or in other words, reconciliation. At this point in time, I would like to welcome to the Zoom virtual stage our inaugural postdoctoral fellow for the Race and Reconciliation Initiative. This individual is someone that you definitely want to get to know. She comes to us by way of Louisiana State University, where she obtained her PhD, and is an absolutely phenomenal researcher and anthropologist in terms of her being able to go to various places, study people and understand their stories and bring their voices to light. She is also in charge of our oral history project, of which you will be hearing more about shortly. So I'm so very excited for today's presentation, and I'm sure that you all will walk away with something new as well to learn. And with any further ado, why don't we welcome to the stage Dr. Sylviane Green Sword.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for this wonderful introduction, Dr. G. I hope I live up to that description. So today we will indeed talk about Charley Thorp, who worked for TCU at its beginning up until about the 1980s. And he apparently was a vital part of life on campus, making life more comfortable, safer, and enjoyable for students and faculty here on campus. So let me see, I should be able to share this slide. There we go. So to summarize today's talk, we will discuss Charley's slave background. He went by Charley Thorp, but in the archives, we have found that he also went by Walter Henry Charles. There were several spellings for his first name and his last name, Thorpe with an E, Thorpe's with an S. But we know that he was the property of Colonel Pleasant Thorpe, who founded the city of Thorp Springs, which now is no longer a city, it's more of a community in the greater area of Granbury. So Colonel Pleasant Thorpe is the one who built the building that was then leased to the Clarks as the first site of the TCU campus. It would later be known as TCU, of course. Charlie was the lead security guard. He was a handyman. He was a landscapist. He was the city's fire chief. His hats go on and on and on. We also know that he married Kate Lee, who was his wife for the longest amount of time. He was married several times. And his wife was actually the descendant of a slave of the woman who would become Randolph Clark's wife. We know that she and Ella Lee, so that's Randolph, Mrs. Randolph as she goes by, they too were close friends. It is possible that they were related. And according to census records, Kate Thorpe was born around 1860. So we know that she and Charlie met when she was probably in her early 20s. She moved to Thorp Springs, and that's where she met Charlie, and they got married and have quite a few children, as we're going to discuss later. So where did we get our sources of information? As Dr. G mentioned, my specialty is ethnography. I do a lot of anthropological research in terms of archives, primary, secondary sources. So for this particular project, we looked at different county archives, Johnston County, Hood County, Tarrant County, to name a few. The next source of information, thank God we made it, is a book by Joseph Lynn Clark, who is the son of Randolph and Ella Blanche Clark. And this work details the family history, and it documents also the founding and the early years of TCU. We traveled to the Granbury Depot with several RRI team members last month. And we visited the depot, which is like a record warehouse. And I spent a day there going through deeds and newspaper, old documents, etc. We also visited the Hood County Genealogical Society, which is an organization that collects family histories, oral history narratives, and artifacts. And they work with the Granbury Museum, which is located in the old jail in Granbury. Karen Nace, who is the director, helped us navigate through museum exhibits, the depot, and she also guided a tour to Thorp Springs and the Colony, which is an African-American neighborhood, which is now mostly deserted. So she took us to those places so we could have an idea of what life was like in the early days of TCU. Our university's library also has special collections, which contain a vast variety of archival resources. Dr. Sue Anderson, with her Race and Reconciliation Initiative Task Force, has done extensive research on Charley Thorp and his family. Also, our archive team, with the help of our librarian, Mary Saffel, have helped uncover valuable information. Ancestry.com, familysearch.org, all of these are tools that we also use to trace the descendants of Charley Thorp. And of course, we did fieldwork observation where we physically traveled to Thorp Springs and Granbury. There's still a mystery around Charley's birth. We don't know exactly when he was born. Because he was born a slave, more than likely there will not be a birth certificate in his name, but census data show that he must be born in 1852 or 1853. And if you see this slide right here, you see that Pleasant Thorpe had 2 slaves at the time. His mother was 37 in 1860, and there is a 7-year-old son here. Based on other documents, such as narrative from the colony and also some of the clerk's record, we know that those 2 slaves that Pleasant Thorpe had listed there were Charley and his mother. What's interesting to consider here is that if you look at the mother, who is 37, says that she's a female, and for race, you see that it's B for Black. Then if you look at Charley, who is a male, you see that for race, you have an M for mulatto, which means that Charley was biracial. We do not know who his father was, but we know that he was very, very close to Colonel Pleasant Thorpe, and that Colonel Pleasant trusted him enough to actually entrust his personal affairs to Charley. So, you know, there is gossip going on and saying that, well, it is possible that Pleasant actually fathered Charley. But then again, that remains to be proven. The official data is not there. We know that they were purchased somewhere between 1850 and 1854. And that was before Colonel officially moved to Hood County. So as I say, we are still investigating, and this is what makes the study kind of interesting, is that the whole mystery surrounding that. So how did he grow up? Well, he was part of the household. So officially he was listed in the census as part of Colonel Pleasant Thorpe's household. The family relationship, however, in census data is left blank. The other white children who lived in the household were clearly listed as son or daughter, but for Charley, it was left blank. According to the census, he was a servant, whatever that term meant in 1880, because that's the time where that census document comes from. We know that Colonel Pleasant Thorpe's slaves helped build the town's infrastructures. That would be the major buildings of Thorp Springs, but also the roads. And among them was Charley Thorpe. We also know that in 1880, Charley was listed as widowed. He was 27 at the time. We later found out that he actually had 2 children from a previous marriage. And we know that he could not read or write according to this census information. We know that Charley gradually assumed the direction of Pleasant Thorpe's personal affairs after the war. So he remained in Thorp Springs after 1865, and he actually was hired by TCU to complete different janitorial assignments. He was also there to help ensure that the schedule was respected. He was there to also provide landscaping services, and he serviced the whole town of Thorp Springs and was a highly respected member of the community. This picture, we do not know for sure that it is Charley. We see that there is a biracial man standing in front of the building, or what appears to be a biracial man. We also know that this picture was taken, as you see in the background, this is the 2.5-story building that was the initial site of Adrian Male and Female College. So that was before the other buildings were built. So we are talking the early 1870s. At that time, Charley would have been somewhere between 17 and 22 years old, which corresponds to what we see on that picture right here. So we do not know for sure that it is Charley, but indications strongly suggest that he is. What about Kate? Kate is listed as having Lee for last name, which means that either she was related to the Lee family or that she was adopted. Now, we know that when Kate's mother was about to die, she asked this lady named Susanna Lee to take care of her children, which was Kate and her older brother. So Kate was actually under legal guardianship of Susanna Lee. We know that Ella, who would become Ella Thorpe, grew up with Kate Lee. And apparently they had a good relationship. Again, gossip says, well, it is possible that they were sisters. It is possible. She is listed as biracial according to the census. She has an M for mulatto, which means that she had a white parent. And we know that her mother was Black, according to the Clark's memoirs. According to census, Kate was able to read, but not able to write. Again, you can see that the family relationship is left blank in the census. We know that she was married to a man whose last name is Williams, and that she had one son called Lily. Apparently he went by Lee Williams. Here would be Oswald Walter Lee, his wife Susanna Lee. These are the parents of Ella Clark, who would marry Randolph Clark. In this picture, which is actually a picture of Sally Clark. Now, this is the wife of Addison Clark. This picture, you see a colored couple and a child. Based on the year, this was in the late 1890s, so that was before the campus moved to Waco, but that was right before that time. So if we calculate correctly, Charlie would have been in his late 40s, early 50s. And so that would correspond to what we see. Again, we do not know for sure that it is Charlie, but the literature suggests that it might be him. And that this woman is likely to be a Thorpe, who was also providing services at TCU. One of the things that we're trying to do with this project was to trace slave descendant communities. So Charlie was a great start with this investigation. We are still working on tracing his children. He had 10 that we know for sure, with several women, 2 with Lee Ann Hightower, which is important because the Hightower family was a prominent family in the community of Granbury and around Thorp Springs. To this day, the Hightowers are known for the services that they render to the community. So Charlie having children with Lee Ann Hightower might help us trace some of his descendants. We know that he married Molly Thorpe. She might be the woman who died when he returned to live with Colonel Pleasant Thorpe. They had at least one child together. Charlie and Kate had at least 7 children, and we traced one child with a woman named J.C. Garland. So who is he? What can we find out about Charlie as an individual, as a human being, rather than just another slave or just another janitor? This is what we really wanted to focus on. We wanted to be able to tell his story, to talk about his personality, to even detail some of the anecdotes that make him a distinct individual. The literature does give insight to his personality, his work ethic. Clearly, he was someone who was very punctual, very disciplined. I'm going to read a passage from Thank God We Made It. I thought this passage was really interesting because a lot of time when we think about a slave remaining with his owner after emancipation, you know, it can be easy to have preconceived ideas as to his submissive nature, etc. But when it came to Charley Thorpe, I think that things didn't quite work that way. So here we have Charlie attending a service. and Randolph Clark was preaching. So here is what Joseph Lynn Clark tells us. Nor in matters spiritual was Charley insensible. After arranging the chapel for religious services on Sunday, he remained conveniently about the building, usually attentive to the sermon of the hour. One morning, after listening to a sermon by Mr. Randolph, he appeared at the Clark home to seek enlightenment on the preacher's discourse. "What is it, Charley?" asked Mr. Randolph, thinking that perhaps he had aroused Charley's interest in his soul's salvation. Replied Charley, "Here's what I want to know. Is what you say in that sermon so, or were you just preaching?" Tactfully, the minister began to expound more fully the way of salvation. His daughter, Luella, somewhat imbued with the missionary spirit, interrupted in a more direct manner. "Now listen to me, Charley," she demanded. "You know good and well what you ought to do. You go right down to the creek now and be baptized and quit your cursing. If you don't, you're going right to the bad place." "Look here, Sue," replied Charley, using his nickname for her. "You know that don't do some folks no good. It sure didn't take on you. Anyway, I ain't got nothing to worry about. Mr. Randolph always gives me his old hats. And don't you know, when we get up yonder, he's going to give me his old wore-out crown?" So you see that he has no problem teasing this little girl and, as some people would say, putting her back in her place. So he was not living in fear of white people. He had no problem being himself around them and asking questions and even questioning what was being preached by the Clarks. We also know that he had a complicated romantic life, and the records probably illustrates that the blood ties between masters and slaves were actually well in effect. So we are talking about two communities living side by side, the Thorps and the Thorpes, or the Lees and the Lees. And we think that they have the same last name simply because, well, one enslaved the other, but we know that, they could actually be related. So this oral history report, so that I pursued, show that the Thorpes were in very high standing in the community. All the documents that we have found show that they were very respected, and Charley, being the fire chief in the town of Thorp Springs, also helped with their reputation as a strong contributor to the community. So when we went to Thorp Springs, Karen Nace, who is a local historian, talked about some of the challenges of finding reliable data, which is an issue that I addressed in the interview when I interviewed her. And I'm going to play this brief clip because it summarizes challenges of finding reliable information. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. And I'm going to replay that technical malfunction.
Dr. Greensword, Dr. Greensword,
Yes.
if you can restart the presentation, check the box for share sound in the lower left-hand corner, and then play again.
All right, so I go to share. Okay. You might have to walk me through this, Dr. G.
Okay, so now that you stop sharing, press share screen again.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the lower left-hand corner box that says share sound,
Makes sense.
click that, and then we should be good to go.
Sorry about that. Thank you.
No, y'all good, y'all good. And is your volume up?
Yes. Please. Let's try again. Okay, share sound. Let's try again.
Well, we've uncovered a number of mistakes here that were passed down through oral history. Some of them with the use of newspaper articles and comparing that to what was said. Sometimes, and we have a huge number of like actual county records that were handwritten at the time. And I rely on that. I mean, if the county clerk wrote something in 1872 in a document, just like a deed, then I have to believe that what he wrote at that time was as factual as it could be. The fact that somebody in 1970 or 1980 said what they believed, but that doesn't match the document, where I give more weight to the written document. Now, the newspaper articles, that's a crapshoot. And today, you can pick up and read an article about something that you saw happen, and you're not sure you were actually there at the same. So it's people's viewpoints are very different. We rely mostly on the written county records when it comes to court records, documents, that kind of stuff. We take what the families have passed down, we take all the stories we have, and we try and sort out to the best of our ability what makes the most sense. We're probably not always right, but we do the best we can with what we have.
Yeah, I found it some music because this is one trademark of Dr. G. We do the best we can with what we have. And that's exactly how we have to proceed when it comes to oral history narratives and memoirs and those kind of documents. So we put different sources together and we see where things match. For instance, I looked at the census record for the household of Charley Thorp and Kate Thorpe, and on the census form, Charley is actually listed as Walter Henry, which was interesting because I know that Kate married only one Thorpe to my knowledge. So I found in another document that actually one of the aliases for Charley Thorpe, one of the aliases for Walter was Charles Thorpe. And this is how we put everything together and we make sense of the documents that we find. Of course, if we want to be accurate, we will prioritize those county records, those official documents over newspapers and over those oral history narratives. But at the same time, we want to consider those vignettes of time and those personal testimonies that oral history have to offer. So I wanted to present the story of a man known for his altruism. Several narratives say that Charley was always willing to go the extra mile, whether it was taking care of a sick student or taking care of a sick friend. He was known to just be reliable. He would be nursing whoever was sick for however long it took. He assumed the janitorial duties, and that is important to notice because at the time, janitorial duties were very different from what they are today, in the sense that none of what we take for granted, like having heating and air conditioning, none of these things were automated. So he had to manually be responsible for all of that. We know that in the 1880s, there were only about 100 Black people in the county. So it was important to bring to light the history of the Thorpe and the contribution that they made, because they changed the cultural landscape of the area. One more thing that I wanted to note was that Charley was known as the enforcer. Randall Clark later called him the FBI, because he was there ensuring that the campus was safe. There is that episode where somebody was suspected of stealing peaches from the orchard. So Charley, he sat there and hid in the bushes to figure out who was stealing. And when he caught the culprit, he just pounced on him. Turned out it was actually Randall Clark himself. So these are little stories that are interesting to figure out what kind of person he was. It's also important to notice that he was allowed to report and to discipline students' misconduct. And the reason why I want to bring this to light is because in my oral history project interviews, I interviewed an alumni who was here in 1965. And she reported that at the time, the first class of integrated TCU was not allowed to have RA position in the dorms because students' parents would not want an African-American to discipline their children. But yet, Charley Thorp was allowed to do that. So it's interesting to see the difference of his status over what happened later on after Jim Crow. And that will conclude this presentation. So I don't know if we're ready to move to Q&A.
Well, we've
Absolutely. First, just want to say thank you so much for that very insightful, engaging presentation, Dr. Greensword. So we do have some questions, and root of me, my name is Marcellus Perkins. I'm the graduate assistant here for RRI. Come as one, stand as 10,000. And I can say that being able to work alongside you, Dr. G, and the rest of the RRI team, we've been able to kind of uncover a lot of interesting truths and histories and perspectives. So in asking some of these questions, kind of let the audience know, what was it like to you to uncover the story of Charley Thorp? And a lot of times when we're reading history books and we speak of those who were enslaved, we aren't able to talk about the small details, the small instances of their lives. We kind of forget that under this blanket of oppression, these are human beings. These are still humans who were married, had children, had certain habits and hobbies that we even today do as well. So kind of what was that like to kind of uncover that history?
It was, and I shouldn't say was because we're still working on it.
Right.
It is so captivating to put a face to the slave population in Hood County. It is, it's very empowering to be able to give them a voice, right. Even though these are people who passed away, many years ago, they still have a voice, and that voice has been muted for too long. So being part of a project that is able to bring them back to life, so to speak, it's captivating. My specialty is anthropology, so I'm right. interested in the cultural part. So reading those little vignettes, those slices of life, is helping put the human story back together, like pieces of a puzzle. And to me, it's fantastic. Now, I didn't do this by myself. Clearly, I had a lot of help, and the archive crew has been fantastic. Dr. Sue Anderson. I think she's just as obsessed with the Thorpe legacy as I am. So, it was nice to also do this as part of a team.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the questions that we received is, are there any opportunities for other TCU members to tour Thorp Springs and experience some of the history more tangibly?
Absolutely, absolutely. The museum is open close to 7 days a week. And honestly, Mrs. Karen Nace she's been fantastic. If you just, call the Hood County Genealogical Society, she will make plans to make sure that she's there and she can tour you around. She's very knowledgeable. So yes, it is open. It's a museum, so it's a public place.
Another question. So with finding, kind of the small details about Charley Thorp's life, we can imagine or expect that he may not have been the only one, correct? The only enslaved person who helped build TCU or work the campus. Has there been any other findings or any other kind of hints that there were other enslaved people alongside Charley who worked in Thorp Springs, but as well as helped build TCU?
According to oral history, yes. But according to census data, we still haven't found. The truth is that Hood County it's not plantation country. So, you're not going to find that big slave descendant community as you would in places like Virginia or Louisiana. I mean, it's just not there. So after the Civil War, the Clarks, they just wanted to move on, and they were like, well, let's invest in education and try to rebuild. So it wasn't so much of a slavery legacy type of community. And the 100 Black people who were there, few of them were actually slaves who had remained with their former masters. Several of them had come from elsewhere as freed Black men. So we're not going to find a lot of data about the slave population simply because the practice wasn't that prevalent over there.
Absolutely, that makes sense. I guess another question that we received in the chat is, being that Charley wasn't formally educated, he wasn't taught how to read or write, do you have any findings on what education looked like for Black children, Black young adults, Black people, Black population in Thorp Springs at the time, being that TCU was educating people, but were there any efforts to educate the local Black population?
Thank you for bringing that up. Actually, when Charley passed, Randolph Clark wrote an eloquent narrative about Charley and about how intelligent he was and how he could have been the next Booker T. Washington, but he was such, a pity that he wasn't able to study. It sounds like a paradox coming from somebody who built that educational institution.
Right.
But he said that, the Moors didn't allow it at the time. These are Randolph Clark's words. His children, however, according to census, we know that at least 2 of them were in school at the time of the census, which was in the late 19th century. But the schools in the area, there were 3 schools in the area. And all the schools did not go beyond the 8th grade. So anyone who wanted to pursue an education beyond 8th grade had to be bused to Fort Worth. And I say bust, but there wasn't that kind of transportation available at the time.
Right.
So it would have been very hard to prioritize education for this community. The Black community, most of the Black children would attend a school that would be close to a neighborhood called the Colony. That neighborhood is no more. I visited the site and most of it has been destroyed, and most of the Black population has left, gone to as far as California, all places throughout the country.
Right. Wow, that's interesting. And as we continue to talk, just more questions are coming up for me. One thing that I heard you say, which is pretty interesting, is that in this reflection that Randolph Clark wrote on Charley Thorp, he says that Charley had the potential to be as notable as Booker T. Washington. For those that don't know, a prominent Black scholar of his era, but yet he didn't feel that he held any responsibility in the restriction of Charley Thorp. We're talking about someone who helped build TCU, who was enslaved, who was rented out from Colonel Thorpe. So in your findings, did you find any type of remorse or any type of reflection from Randolph Clark in saying that, I did have some type of responsibility in this, even if I wasn't quote unquote the owner, there's still some type of ownership power dynamic in play that I have participated in?
I have not found anything that particularly speaks to that. But what I do know is that in the 1920s, Randolph Clark and his son, they did take part in the interracial commission. So there was some growth. We also know that Randolph Clark was, he was helping the Confederacy. And that's the reason why TCU had to be a private institution. Right. He and his brother and his father, they wanted to invest in a public institution after the war. But because they supported the Confederacy, the ironclad oath said that, you had to swear that you never supported the Confederacy. Right. We know that their father, Joseph A. Clark, made some pretty racist comments. So this is the kind of household that he emerged from. Their father, Joseph A. Clark, had slaves that he rented out, and just, treated as property. This is the type of household that Randolph Clark grew up in. So having grown up in a house like that, and then served in the Confederacy, but yet being able to be part of an interracial commission, I guess it shows that there was some kind of change, not so much an admission of guilt, but he did write this in his memoirs though. He did say that he wished that in the time of reckoning, he would not be remembered for the part he played in the Confederacy. He said he would like to have that part just wiped off his record.
And I think, for conversation purposes, when we're looking at history and we only look at one side of the story, or we only look at, the founding of TCU, but not necessarily the participation in the Confederacy or the participation in the enslavement system, we lose stories like Charley Thorp, right? Like these stories become washed away, they become hidden, they become cast into the shadows. So I guess, in reference to that, my follow-up is, what do we do next with that information of finding out who Charley Thorp was, his place in TCU, in Thorp Springs, and what he was able to contribute, despite not being able to express his humanity in the fullest way possible, of being a full human being, right? But yet still finding ways to contribute to this big ivory tower that we have amongst us. What do we do with that in your perspective?
I see two very concrete steps that I believe need to be taken. And number one, we rewrite history, because history has been, like you say, the white ivory tower. We have about 4 to 5 different books written just on the history of TCU. Right. I could probably count the number of pages in the book that include the contribution of Black people. And that something needs to be done. And, I'm glad that the Race and Reconciliation Initiative is taking that corrective step. Right. But yeah, we correct the narrative. We tell the story, we include them in the history of TCU. Okay. Number two, we find their descendants. And I believe that this is a way to not just honor the memory of the African Americans who contributed to the institution that benefits all of us, right. But it's a way to keep history alive. It's a way to give credence to those oral history narratives. It's a way to just build community.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think, one of the things that I found very interesting in your presentation was the roles and the many hats that Charley Thorp wore, and then the connection that was made to the interview that was taken from the TCU alum from the 1960s, who said that, Black students weren't allowed to be RAs. We weren't allowed to be RAs out of fear from white parents that their child would be in close contact or proximity to a African American in positions of power, right? So that's the other part, in positions of power. But yet Charley Thorp was the fire chief, correct? Right. So that very interesting. I think you called it out as, you know, this paradox of shifting consciousness and the shift of perception of power. You know, in your findings, were there any recollections or any type of hintings of how people perceive Charley Thorp in positions of power? Because I think, you know, it's one thing for us to tell the story of Charley Thorp as the janitor or the custodian, which we don't necessarily associate power and prestige to those positions when we should, because without them, the school does not run. But for him to hold those positions and be a police chief and be the enforcer of school conduct and policy, that's a position of power. So was there any type of writings on that, how people perceive that as a formerly enslaved person holding positions of power on TCU's campus?
Yeah, I have not found any direct narrative about that, but what I do know is that they call him by his first name. They call him Charlie, not Mr. Charlie, just Charlie. Even that girl, Randolph Clark's daughter, she was underage at the time. She was younger than Charlie, but she said, like, look here, Charlie. So, you know, I kind of glad that, you know, Charlie, like, he had like that repartee and he was able to like just, you know, respond immediately and with such, you know, such authority. But yeah, he was called Charlie. He was not called Mr. Charlie. He was not called Mr. Thorpe. He was Charlie, not even Charles.
Wow. So I guess, you know, as we're coming up on time, I'll ask this closing question to you. How do we honor Mr. Charley Thorp moving forward in 2021? You know, what is our responsibility, and who are we accountable to in making sure that his legacy is honored and his story is told? Because I think when we tell his story, we also indirectly tell the other stories of people who've been forgotten, whose stories have been pushed into the shadows, and in some way they're still attached to him. So when we tell his story, we're telling the stories of those who we can't name because we just don't know. So how do we honor that? And how do we hold ourselves accountable to that responsibility?
Wow. That's deep. I believe that, you know, the group of people who founded TCU is small enough to include him. He cannot fall into the cracks as, well, he was just the janitor. I mean, we're talking about a university campus of one building.
Right.
I believe the janitor should be mentioned there because he was part of staff.
Right.
So correcting history, as I said earlier, is definitely the #1 step. And as we're still working on his family tree, which is quite complex, as you can imagine,
right,
we're discovering parts of his personality. And hopefully when we do locate his descendants, then we can further those oral history narratives that can give us a broader picture of what it was like to be Charley Thorp.
Wow. Dr. Greenswood, I just want to again thank you for your time, energy, and effort in doing this presentation and starting us off with the RI Ramp Up Week. We have an exciting week ahead of us, but in this moment right now, I just want to say thank you because again, I learned a lot. I'm sure that all of our attendees have learned much as well. And as we close, I just want to again start by thanking all the participants for coming out today. You could have been anywhere in the world, anywhere in the Zoom universe, but you decided to spend your noon with us. So for that, we appreciate. For those who weren't able to attend, or if you had colleagues or peers that wanted to attend, this session has been recorded, will be uploaded to our YouTube, and will be accessible on the RI website. Tomorrow, we invite you to come out for our Who is Mr. Fred Rouse presentation, which will be led by Professor Adam McKinney. Just in short, Mr. Fred Rouse was an African-American man in Fort Worth who was lynched, and this tragic incident has some ties to TCU. in some way. So we definitely encourage you to attend to become more educated on that matter. Additionally, check out the RRI website for more updates and more content and more information. As we find things, as we are uploading material, we are putting it onto the website. So we ask that you check it out periodically to just understand or just kind of get where we're going and where we're headed. As we gear up for Reconciliation Day, which will be April 21st, you don't want to miss it. We have some great speakers. Chancellor Boschini will be there and other dignitaries of our TCU community. Additionally, we invite you to check out our podcast, Reconcile This. This podcast is hosted by Dr. G and myself, where we kind of highlight different members of our TCU community, the people that we consider champions, that do the work day in and day out of reconciliation and healing in different aspects on campus. So with that being said, I've attached the links to all three things mentioned. And as we close, I just want to say that we thank you all for your time, energy, and effort for joining us today. As Dr. G always says, we may not have all the answers, we may not have all the conclusions, but we are doing the best we can with what we have. And with that being said, we thank you. And one last thing, we do have a library exhibit in the Breezeway, in the NBC Breezeway, that you should check out, that Dr. Greensward has worked tirelessly on, and would encourage you all to just kind of get an insight on the more of the work that we've been doing here with RRI. Until next time.